Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of Job. Today's video is going to be pretty short because our reading is pretty short. We're going to look at chapters 25 and 26 of Job, and chapter 25 is only 6 verses long. So today we'll be looking at Bildad. Remember Job's friend Bildad talking to him first, and then we're going to see the beginning of Job's response in chapter 26. So let's get right into it. So chapter 25 is Bildad, and Bildad's speech can really be broken down into two different parts. The first 3 verses focus on the power of God. He points out all the things that God can do, and basically there's nothing that God can't do, and that's what Bildad is pointing out. And in the second half, he moves on to rightly point out that no one can claim to be righteous before God. And on this point, he's correct, because the Bible tells us that our righteousness is as filthy rags to God. So we should pay attention to what he says here because he's right, and it's something that we need to understand as well. Since man, by reason of his fallen state, are corrupt, and we have a corrupt nature, is nothing compared to God's holiness. Even in his best righteousness, we have need to be born again, that being justified by faith in Christ, we may have peace with God. So what Bildad was saying here is he was looking at the power of God and how flawed we are as humans, as mankind, and how none of us are good enough. None of us are righteous. There is none righteous. And that's why we need to be justified through faith in Christ. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. Now, Bildad wasn't pointing to Christ because Christ had not come yet, but he was pointing Job to God and us. The way that we are justified is through Christ. And so then that brings us to Job, his response then in chapter 26. Job responds by saying essentially, who are you to tell me these things? Who have you helped with these lectures? What is all this kind of bloviating? What is it good for? And he's actually correct because they haven't been helpful to Job at all. He then goes on to talk about all the incredible things that God has done. With all the fantastic truths that Job listed, they're all summed up there in verse 14 when he says, these are but the fringes of his ways. So when we look at chapter 26, and this is another short chapter as well. I mean, this whole reading is only about 20 verses long. And when I say about, I mean, it's exactly 20 verses long. And Job talks about, starting in verse 5 down through 14, he's talking about how powerful God is and all the things that God has done, how he created the earth, how he made it to work as it is with the waters and the clouds and the sun, and how all of those things work together. And he goes on to summarize it and says, all of these incredible things that we can't even comprehend or even fathom, these are but the fringes of his ways. As much as we know about the majesty of God from observing creation, we've only scratched the surface of what he can do. So Job's response here is essentially, who are you to give me advice, to Bildad? And then he goes on to acknowledge the power of God and how great God is and all that he has done. And it's important that we see and we notice that Job, even with all he's been through, he hasn't forgotten God. He hasn't forgotten how powerful he is, and he hasn't forgotten his place and where he stands with God, even if he doesn't understand why everything's happening that is happening to him. So that's all for today. Obviously, short video, short reading. Hope you took the time to do it. And that's all for today. We will see the rest of Job's response next week in chapter 27. But until then, I will see you tomorrow in the book of Jeremiah.